Section 21 of Essays of Schopenhauer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arden. Essays of Schopenhauer by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by Sarah Hay Dirks. The Metaphysics of Love, Part 3. The following is necessary for this neutralization of which we are speaking. The particular degree of his manhood must exactly correspond to the particular degree of her womanhood, in order to exactly balance the one-sidedness of each. Hence, the most manly man will desire the most womanly woman, and vice versa, and so each will want the individual that exactly corresponds to him in degree of sex. Inasmuch as two persons fulfill this necessary relation towards each other, it is instinctively felt by them, and is the origin, together with the other relative considerations, of the higher degrees of love. While, therefore, two lovers are pathetically talking about the harmony of their souls, the kernel of the conversation is for the most part the harmony concerning the individual and its perfection, which obviously is of much more importance than the harmony of their souls, which frequently turns out to be a violent discord shortly after marriage. We now come to those other relative considerations which depend on each individual trying to eradicate, through the medium of another, his weaknesses, deficiencies, and deviations from the type, in order that they may not be perpetuated in the child that is to be born, or develop into absolute abnormities. The weaker a man is in muscular power, the more will he desire a woman who is muscular, and the same thing applies to a woman. Nevertheless, if a big woman choose a big husband, in order perhaps to present a better appearance in society, the children, as a rule, suffer for her folly. Again, another very decided consideration is complexion. Blonde people fancy either absolutely dark complexions or brown, but it is rarely the case vice versa. The reason for it is this, that fair hair and blue eyes are a deviation from the type, and almost constitute an abnormity, analogous to white mice, or at any rate white horses. They are not indigenous to any other part of the world but Europe, not even to the polar regions, and are obviously of Scandinavian origin. En passant, it is my conviction that a white skin is not natural to man, and that by nature he has either a black or brown skin, like our forefathers, the Hindus, and that the white man was never originally created by nature, and that therefore there is no race of white people, much as it is talked about, but every white man is a bleached one, driven up into the north, where he was a stranger, and where he existed only like an exotic plant, in need of a hothouse in winter. Man, in the course of centuries, became white. The Gypsies, an Indian tribe which emigrated only about 4 centuries ago, show the transition of the Hindu's complexion to ours. In love, therefore, nature strives to return to dark hair and brown eyes, because they are the original type. Still, a white skin has become second nature, although not to such an extent as to make the dark skin of the Hindu repellent to us. Finally, every man tries to find the corrective of his own defects and aberrations in the particular parts of his body, and the more conspicuous the defect is, the greater is his determination to correct it. This is why snub-nosed persons find an aquiline nose or a parrot-like face so indescribably pleasing, and the same thing applies to every other part of the body. Men of immoderately long and attenuated build delight in a stunted and short figure. Considerations of temperament also influence a man's choice. Each prefers a temperament the reverse of his own, but only insofar as his is a decided one. A man who is quite perfect in some respect himself does not, it is true, desire and love imperfection in this particular respect, yet he can be more easily reconciled to it than another man, because he himself saves the children from being very imperfect in this particular. For instance, a man who has a very white skin himself will not dislike a yellowish complexion, while a man who has a yellowish complexion will consider a dazzlingly white skin divinely beautiful. It is rare for a man to fall in love with a positively ugly woman, but when he does, it is because exact harmony in the degree of sex exists between them, and all her abnormities are precisely the opposite to, that is to say, the corrective of his. Love in these circumstances is wont to attain a high degree. The profoundly earnest way in which we criticize and narrowly consider every part of a woman, while she on her part considers us, the scrupulously careful way we scrutinize a woman who is beginning to please us, the fickleness of our choice, the strained attention with which a man watches his fiancée, the care he takes not to be deceived in any trait, and the great importance he attaches to every more or less essential trait. All this is quite in keeping with the importance of the end, for the child that is to be born will have to bear a similar trait through its whole life. For instance, if a woman stoops but a little, it is possible for her son to be inflicted with a hunchback, and so in every other respect. We are not conscious of all this naturally. On the contrary, each man imagines that his choice is made in the interest of his own pleasure, which, in reality, cannot be interested in it at all. His choice, which we must take for granted, is in keeping with his own individuality, is made precisely in the interest of the species, to maintain the type of which as pure as possible is the secret task. In this case, the individual unconsciously acts in the interest of something higher, that is, the species. This is why he attaches so much importance to things to which he might, nay, would be otherwise indifferent. There is something quite singular in the unconsciously serious and critical way two young people of different sex look at each other on meeting for the first time, in the scrutinizing and penetrating glances they exchange, in the careful inspection which their various traits undergo. This scrutiny and analysis represent the meditation of the genius of the species on the individual which may be born and the combination of its qualities, and the greatness of their delight in and longing for each other is determined by this meditation. This longing, although it may have become intense, may possibly disappear again if something previously unobserved comes to light, and so the genius of the species meditates concerning the coming race in all who are not yet too old. It is Cupid's work to fashion this race, and he is always busy, always speculating, always meditating. The affairs of the individual in their whole ephemeral totality are very trivial compared with those of this divinity, which concern the species and the coming race. Therefore he is always ready to sacrifice the individual regardlessly. He is related to these ephemeral affairs as an immortal being is to a mortal, and his interests to theirs as infinite to finite. Conscious, therefore, of administering affairs of a higher order than those that concern merely the weal and woe of the individual, he administers them with sublime indifference amid the tumult of war, the bustle of business, or the raging of a plague. Indeed, he pursues them into the seclusion of the cloisters. It has been seen that the intensity of love grows with its individuation. We have shown that two individuals may be so physically constituted that in order to restore the best possible type of the species, the one is the special and perfect complement of the other, which in consequence exclusively desires it. In a case of this kind, passionate love arises, and as it is bestowed on one object, and one only, that is to say, because it appears in the special service of the species, it immediately assumes a nobler and sublimer nature. On the other hand, mere sexual instinct is base, because, without individuation, it is directed to all, and strives to preserve the species merely as regards quantity, with little regard for quality. Intense love concentrated on one individual may develop to such a degree that unless it is gratified, all the good things of this world, and even life itself, lose their importance. It then becomes a desire, the intensity of which is like none other. Consequently, it will make any kind of sacrifice, and should it happen that it cannot be gratified, it may lead to madness or even suicide. Besides these unconscious considerations, which are the source of passionate love, there must be still others, which we have not so directly before us. Therefore, we must take it for granted that here there is not only a fitness of constitution, but also a special fitness between the man's will and the woman's intellect, in consequence of which a perfectly definite individual can be born to them alone, whose existence is contemplated by the genius of the species for reasons to us impenetrable, since they are the very essence of the thing in itself, or more strictly speaking, the will to live desires to objectivize itself in an individual which is precisely determined, and can only be begotten by this particular father and this particular mother. This metaphysical yearning of the will in itself has immediately, as its sphere of action in the circle of human beings, the hearts of the future parents, who accordingly are seized with this desire. They now fancy that it is for their own sakes they are longing for what at present has purely a metaphysical end, that is to say, for what does not come within the range of things that exist in reality. In other words, it is the desire of the future individual to enter existence, which has first become possible here, a longing which proceeds from the primary source of all being, and exhibits itself in the phenomenal world as the intense love of the future parents for each other, and has little regard for anything outside itself. In fact, love is an illusion like no other. It will induce a man to sacrifice everything he possesses in the world in order to obtain this woman, who in reality will satisfy him no more than any other. It also ceases to exist when the end, which was in reality metaphysical, has been frustrated perhaps by the woman's barrenness, which, according to Hufeland, is the result of 19 accidental defects in the constitution, just as it is frustrated daily in millions of crushed germs in which the same metaphysical life principle struggles to exist. There is no other consolation in this than that there is an infinity of space, time, and matter, and consequently inexhaustible opportunity, at the service of the will to live. Although this subject has not been treated by Theophrastus Paracelsus, and my entire train of thought is foreign to him, yet it must have presented itself to him, if even in a cursory way, when he gave utterance to the following remarkable words, written in quite a different context, and in his usual desultory style. Hae sunt, quos Deus copulavit, ut eam, quae fuit Uriae et David, quamvis ex diametro, sic enim sibi humana mens persuadebat, cum justo et legitimo matrimonio puniat hoc, sed propter Salomonum, qui alunde nasci non potuit, nisi ex Bathseba conjuncto David semine, quamvis meretrice conjunxit Deos. The yearning of love, the himeros, which has been expressed in countless ways and forms by the poets of all ages, without their exhausting the subject, or even doing it justice, this longing, which makes us imagine that the possession of a certain woman will bring interminable happiness, and the loss of her unspeakable pain. This longing and this pain do not arise from the needs of an ephemeral individual, but are, on the contrary, the sigh of the spirit of the species, discerning irreparable means of either gaining or losing its ends. It is the species alone that has an interminable existence. Hence it is capable of endless desire, endless gratification, and endless pain. These, however, are imprisoned in the heart of the mortal. No wonder, therefore, if it seems like to burst, and can find no expression for the announcements of endless joy or endless pain. This it is that forms the substance of all erotic poetry that is sublime in character, which consequently soars into transcendent metaphors, surpassing everything earthly. This is the theme of Petrarch, the material for the St. Preux, Werthers, and Jacopo Ortiz, who otherwise could be neither understood nor explained. This infinite regard is not based on any kind of intellectual, nor, in general, upon any real merits of the beloved one, because the lover frequently does not know her well enough, as was the case with Petrarch. It is the spirit of the species alone that can see at a glance of what value the beloved one is to it for its purposes. Moreover, great passions, as a rule, originate at first sight. Whoever loved that loved not at first sight? Shakespeare, As You Like It, 3:5. Curiously enough, there is a passage touching upon this in Guzman del Alfarache, a well-known romance written 250 years ago by Mateo Alemán. No es necesario para que uno ame, que pasa distancia de tiempo, que siga discurso en haga elección, sino que con aquella primera y sola vista concurran juntamente cierta correspondencia o consonancia, o lo que acá solemos vulgarmente decir, una confrontación de sangre, a que por particular influxo suelen mover las estrellas. For a man to love, there is no need for any length of time to pass for him to weigh considerations or make his choice, but only that a certain correspondence and consonance is encountered on both sides at the first and only glance, or that which is ordinarily called a sympathy of blood, to which a peculiar influence of the stars generally impels. Accordingly, the loss of the beloved one through a rival, or through death, is the greatest pain of all to those passionately in love, just because it is of a transcendental nature, since it affects him not merely as an individual, but also assails him in his essentia aeterna, in the life of the species, in whose special will and service he was here called. This is why jealousy is so tormenting and bitter, and the giving up of the loved one the greatest of all sacrifices. My hero is ashamed of showing any kind of emotion but that which may be the outcome of love. The reason for this is that when he is in love, it is not he, but the species, which is grieving. In Calderon's Zenobia the Great, there is a scene in the second act between Zenobia and Decius, where the latter says, Celos, luego tú me quieres, perdiera 100,000 victorias, volvierme, etc. Heavens, then you love me. For this I would sacrifice 1,000 victories, etc. In this case, honor, which has hitherto outweighed every other interest, is driven out of the field directly. Love, i.e., the interest of the species, comes into play and discerns something that will be of decided advantage to itself, for the interest of the species, compared with that of the mere individual, however important this may be, is infinitely more important. Honor, duty, and fidelity succumb to it after they have withstood every other temptation, the menace of death even. We find the same going on in private life. For instance, a man has less conscience when in love than in any other circumstances. Conscience is sometimes put on one side, even by people who are otherwise honest and straightforward, and infidelity recklessly committed if they are passionately in love, i.e., when the interest of the species has taken possession of them. It would seem, indeed, as if they believe themselves conscious of a greater authority than the interests of individuals could ever confer. This is simply because they are concerned in the interests of the species. Schopenhauer's utterance in this respect is remarkable. Quand un homme et une femme ont l'un pour l'autre une passion violente, il me semble toujours que quels soient les obstacles qui les séparent, un mari, des parents, etc. Les deux amants sont l'un à l'autre de par la nature, qu'ils s'appartiennent de droit divin, malgré les lois et les conventions humaines. From this standpoint, the greater part of the Decameron seems a mere mocking and jeering on the part of the genius of the species at the rights and interests of the individual which it treads underfoot. Inequality of rank and all similar relations are put on one side with the same indifference and disregarded by the genius of the species. If they thwart the union of two people passionately in love with one another, it pursues its ends pertaining to endless generations, scattering human principles and scruples abroad like chaff. For the same reason, a man will willingly risk every kind of danger, and even become courageous, although he may otherwise be faint-hearted. What a delight we take in watching, either in a play or novel, two young lovers fighting for each other, i.e., for the interest of the species, and their defeat of the old people, who had only in view the welfare of the individual. For the struggling of a pair of lovers seems to us so much more important, delightful, and consequently justifiable than any other, as the species is more important than the individual. Accordingly, we have as the fundamental subject of almost all comedies the genius of the species with its purposes running counter to the personal interests of the individuals presented, and in consequence threatening to undermine their happiness. As a rule, it carries out its ends, which in keeping with true poetic justice satisfies the spectator, because the latter feels that the purposes of the species widely surpass those of the individual. Hence he is quite consoled when he finally takes leave of the victorious lovers, sharing with them the illusion that they have established their own happiness, while in truth they have sacrificed it for the welfare of the species, in opposition to the will of the discreet old people. End of section 21. Recording by Arden.